5 a.m. I'm up with a crisp Celsius energy drink. Running 12 miles today. Grab a green juice, quick change, and head to work. Meetings, workshops. One more Celsius, no slowing down. Working late, but obviously still meeting the girls for a little dancing. Celsius. Live, fit, go. Grab a cold, refreshing Celsius at your local retailer or locate now at Celsius.com.
Spring is here and the shopping list is long. Time to make a Lowe's run. Buy 3 bags, get 3 free of Stay Green 1 cubic foot garden soil. Plus, right now, members can earn 4 times the points on an eligible purchase. Start spring off strong with these deals and more. Our best lineup is here at Lowe's. Valid through 3/25 while supplies last. Soil offer excludes Alaska and Hawaii. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. See Lowe's.com/terms for details. Subject to change. Point boosters subject to exclusions and more terms apply. One-time only offer.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Facts are stubborn things, or so said John Adams. And what could be more factual than science? As we've already seen in the podcast, with instances like the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia during Washington's presidency, when politics and public health intersect, things can often get messy. My guest for this episode recently came out with a new book entitled Whiplash: From the Battle for Obamacare to the War on Science, which takes readers through the history of healthcare policy in American history and, as the name suggests, includes more recent developments in the 21st century. David Blumenthal is professor of the practice of public health and health policy at Harvard University and previously served as the national coordinator for health information technology and president of the Commonwealth Fund. James A. Marone is the John Hazen White Professor Emeritus of Political Science, Public Policy, and Urban Studies at Brown University. Blumenthal and Marone previously co-authored another book entitled The Heart of Power: Health and Politics in the Oval Office. We had a fantastic conversation on healthcare policy history, but as always, there is still so much more to be found in their book. So I'll have a link to it on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. Without further ado, after this brief message, let's get to our discussion.
Zootopia 2 has come home to Disney+.
Let's go!
Get ready for a new case.
We're the greatest partners of all time!
New friends.
Gary the Snake.
And your last name?
The Snake.
Dream Team. Get new habitats.
Zootopia has a secret reptile population.
You can watch the record-breaking phenomenon at home. Zootopia 2, now available on Disney+, rated PG. And right now you can get Disney Plus and Hulu for just $4.99 a month for 3 months with a special limited time offer. Ends March 24th. After 3 months, plan auto-renews at $12.99 a month. Terms apply.
David and Jim, thank you so much for joining me today on Presidencies. I greatly appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Jerry. It's great to be here. This is Jim.
Here, David.
So glad to have you here, and congratulations on the publication of this book. It is an amazing read. There is so much in your book that is just so fascinating, and especially the fact that you not only cover some history from further in the past, but also some recent history, helping us to understand some things that some of our listeners may have lived through, may have experienced themselves. And it's an amazing perspective that you bring to it.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And to get us started, because you mention at numerous points in your book that there was a 100-year war in the arena of American politics on the issue of healthcare. Can you tell us more about the origins of healthcare as an issue debated on the national stage in the U.S., and when did it get folded into presidential politics and campaigning?
Yeah, let me jump in on that. It is a 100-year war, and really a remarkable thing is how the war ended really so quietly. But the national health insurance first came up in the 1912 election. Theodore Roosevelt, ex-President Roosevelt, running on the Bull Moose platform, first introduced it. It was an issue in the 19-teens, but it really becomes a presidential issue with Harry Truman. And it happens in a striking way. Franklin Roosevelt and the liberals in his administration were constantly begging him to take the Social Security Act and add health care to it. But he wouldn't do it. And then as the World War II was winding down in 1943, he knew he was going to win, and he needed another crusade for his fourth term. So he got his most trusted advisor, Sam Rosenham, and he said, Sam, write me a national health insurance plan. Roosevelt died before the plan was ready. Harry Truman takes over. He's only met Roosevelt 3 times. He's a complete neophyte. He has no experience, anything comparable to what he now faces in the White House. And 3 weeks after he's in office, here comes this message from the grave of Franklin Roosevelt, a national health insurance plan. And Truman grabs it, makes it the issue of his life. It's the most important issue of his entire career, as he tells us in his autobiography. And he tries, first in 1946 and then in 1949, after his surprising reelection campaign. The Republicans in Congress and the American Medical Association now organize on the other side, and a screaming match ensues. And they pretty much define the terms of the debate. The very arguments, the metaphors, the memes, they're all there in 1949. And you can hear the exact same things about socialism and communism and bureaucracy and social justice right through to 2009. It becomes a essential part of American politics during that Truman era. And the very arguments don't change.
As much as things change, they also stay the same sometimes.
Yes, and as we say, no Democrat after Truman runs for president without promising to rewire the healthcare system. Some were very enthusiastic, like Clinton. Others had to be dragged there by their allies, like Jimmy Carter. But they all tried, and the dirty, rotten secret is most Republicans tried as well. So this has just been a staple, a screaming staple of American politics till Obama put it to rest in 2009. Story we tell, of course.
Absolutely. Well, and it was interesting because you note in your book that healthcare is one of the key issues that helped to define the Democratic Party in the 20th century. Would you mind sharing more about how that came about and how the issue helped change or dictate the party's trajectory over time?
Yes, let me take this one as well and then leave the next one for David. Um, Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal established the American social welfare state, really, with the Social Security Act. And this was the last piece. It's sort of the last piece of the New Deal that never got in place. And the Democrats have been fighting and pushing for it ever since. And it became as we say in the book, an essential part of Democratic politics. Now, it's very interesting to see how it changed. In 1949, Harry Truman would have had cradle-to-grave national health insurance for everyone. And little by little, the Democrats whittled it down. And it was a very interesting, Jerry, a very interesting cycle, which is the Democrats would come up with a plan. The Republicans would say, that's too much socialism, but we'll offer a counter plan. The Democratic plan would go down in flames, and the next Democratic administration would pick up the Republican plan and say, well, this is what you guys suggested last time. Maybe we can agree on this. Boom, it would go down to defeat. The Republicans would cry, that's socialism, even though it was a plan designed by Richard Nixon or the Heritage Foundation or some other Republican or right-leaning outfit, and the Democrats would try again. So in a funny way, the Democrats were the id. They were the pressure for national health insurance, but the Republicans did a lot of the thinking for let's try this, let's try that, and the Democrats would pick it up. By the time Obama comes to office and pushes his health plan, why, he's taking a plan that was designed in part in the Heritage Foundation and tried by a Republican governor, Mitt Romney of Massachusetts, and a Democratic legislature. So sort of a Democratic version of a Republican plan, the latest iteration of a cycle. But there'll be no more of that cycle because the Republicans have now gone to hell no. And the Democrats have a plan in place, which, if they get their way, they can slowly and incrementally expand to cover the rest of the population.
Well, and that's so fascinating to hear that trend of, having a Republican plan that then Democrats pick up. And then, oh gosh, that's socialism. We've got to shut that down. Wasn't just with the Affordable Care Act, but was decades in the making and the cycle that just kept on going.
Truly. And one of the most creative thinkers, really, who kind of laid the foundations for modern health reform is unexpectedly Richard Nixon. He was someone who really had a new vision, which was let's try to put together government funding and private health insurance through employment. And he sort of thought through the modern. Needless to say, the Democrats tried his plan, but that they weren't able to pass in the Carter years, and then to some extent in the Clinton years.
Well, and I think that's one thing that we are getting to in presidential history, kind of this examination, re-examination of Richard Nixon and starting to understand some of the policies and the influence that he had. Now that we are decades beyond Watergate, it's becoming a more full and rich story. And it's fascinating to see that in this too, he played a role.
Mm.
And actually, we're seeing now in the Trump administration a similar dynamic, having tried and failed to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and now dealing with the public anger over this loss of premiums. Trump has seen the need to have a health care proposal, and he's sort of cobbled something together, but it's not a coverage proposal. It's a series of unconnected items. Drug cost control, HSAs, but there is no place now for the Republicans to go because their ideas are in the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah. And it's interesting. This comes up time and again in the history of American politics, kind of trying to cobble together something that isn't necessarily a full plan, but it's being able to say we're doing something to try and move things along.
Yeah.
Well, and that's been part of my work with presidencies is trying to realize kind of the humanity behind all of this, that, in all of the policy debates, in all of the political campaigning, there are still people involved. And that was one interesting thing that came up in your book. You bring up that, quote, presidents throughout history turned to health reform when someone they loved fell ill. And so I was wondering if you could share an example or two of this in presidential history and how this personal dimension impacted the effort to push healthcare reform through.
So this is a great and untold story, partly told in our first book with, for example, John F. Kennedy's embrace of Medicare after his father had a stroke, and also Dwight Eisenhower almost embracing Medicare because of the illness of his mother-in-law. And now in this latest book, the story of why Obama was so insistent and persistent with the Affordable Care Act. And it was, by his own account, in multiple places because of what he saw in the case of his mother, who had cancer and was struggling to get her insurance plan to cover the expenses that it was committed to covering. And that's the story that he brought up with us when we interviewed him. It's the story that he retold at the time when the Affordable Care Act was passed, and he spoke to his staff to thank them. And by the way, Richard Nixon, I should have said, was also deeply influenced by his own personal family history. Two of his brothers died of tuberculosis. Interestingly, the family may have been infected by the raw milk of a cow they owned, because raw milk is an easy way to get tuberculosis. He likely had it himself, though it never progressed to a fatal version of it. And he talked about it all the time with visitors with physicians, and he even talked about it when he resigned. In the little talk he gave as he was about to head off to the helicopter leaving the White House in 1974, in a reverie, he reached back to his mother and his brothers and the tragedy that his family experienced. And it was one of the reasons why he was so creative on healthcare. So yeah, presidents are people, but they don't talk about their own health they talk about their family's health, because to make a reference to their own personal infirmities reduces their perception of power and masculinity and personal capacity. And they are averse to doing that, afraid that they will be judged in some way unable to perform the duties of their office.
And David, that's an excellent point, and it's something that, again, for folks in the modern era, of course, we've heard about presidents and their health for quite a number of years now, and this is nothing new. This even goes back to the time of George Washington. George Washington suffered some major health issues during his presidency, and it was kind of hushed up because they didn't want people to panic. Likewise, you see folks like William Henry Harrison, who at that point was the oldest person to be elected president, trying to prove his vigor, and unfortunately didn't work out so well. He passed away a month into office, but this was still something that has been a thread in presidential history throughout the ages. And so it's interesting trying to use family as kind of a proxy to make that personal connection to why this policy is important, but not being able to talk about, I'm facing these issues.
Well,
Yeah.
in the course I teach on presidents and pandemics, I tell the story about Woodrow Wilson's time at Versailles. This was a case when the great influenza changed the history of the world because of Wilson's contracting influenza, becoming debilitated by it during a critical time in the negotiations for a peace treaty between Germany and its allies and the great powers in the West. And he was unable, because of his debility, to prevent a truly punitive treaty from going into effect, which laid the groundwork for World War II.
And you mentioned William Henry Harrison. The new thinking about that is that there was an open swamp just right north of the White House, and it was a sewer. And it's now thought, speculated, that it was really a gastro kind of poisoning that killed him, and not the old story, which is he didn't wear a coat in the bitter cold of Washington to prove that he was up to the job. And indeed, it's thought that several presidents died, Polk as well, after his presidency, from this open sewer. So it was a public health question that may have gotten Harrison, and not, after all, his macho posturing. But whatever it is, it's the presidency, both the macho posturing and, boy, we need a good public health system. Right back to that day.
I could regale you with all the bacteria that might have infected the presidents from an open sewer. It's great.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny. I'm actually, William Henry Harrison is a personal interest of mine, even beyond just studying the presidency in general. And so I'm so glad to have you second and third that, because I've been trying to spread the word for years, and especially like when you look into his symptoms, when you look into what happened, and the fact that it was put down as pneumonia, but that was kind of a catch-all term at the time when they didn't really know what was going on. But, oh yeah, we've got to put something. So pneumonia, but you look into the symptoms and it's like, this was something else.
And speaking of presidential health, I mean, Garfield, while he was assassinated by a crazed office seeker, of course, it was his physicians who killed him by sticking their unwashed hands in his wounds. So there's a lot of medical stories. And presidents up till recently got inferior medicine because secrecy was more important. Hiding what it was more important than making sure that you got the best medicine available, which in the 1880s was still not very good. But it's only modern presidents who get, as Trump did when he had COVID, the very best treatment available.
Actually, John F. Kennedy got terrible medical care, and partly to maintain secrecy. The healthcare perspective on presidents is fascinating, and it has changed history in many ways.
And really untold ways, sort of quietly,
Yeah.
because they want it to be quiet. They don't want their own health to be an issue. Grover Cleveland, when he had his cancer operated on, his mouth cancer, why, it was on a on a yacht where no one could see it. Imagine there had to be a better, more stable place for his physician to cut out part of his mouth. But no, no one should be able to see that.
And Joe Biden's personal health history is calamitous. Multiple neurosurgeries and long rehabilitation from those on top of his stutter. Anyway, they're human. Presidents are human.
Yeah, and this points to, that there is so much of humanity that's wrapped up in these issues. When we're talking about healthcare, it's important to remember that these are about people, and there are so many other elements and facets in play. It's important to remember. And one important consideration when studying the history of healthcare in the U.S. over time is the element of race. So I was wondering if you would mind discussing how race has factored into the American healthcare debate over the years.
Race always is an important part of social welfare policy. When the Democrats passed Social Security in 1935, the real basis of social welfare policy, it included Social Security, it included AFDC, aid to mothers, unemployment compensation came later, but there were roots of it in that legislation. And lo and behold, Social Security excluded, thanks to the Southern senators, people who were farm workers and domestics. Now, why would they exclude those? They said it was because it would be too hard to keep track of. But there were lots of forms of work that were equally hard to keep track of. No, 80% of African Americans at the time were either working in agriculture or as domestics. And so a easy way to keep them out of Social Security was to simply say we're not going to include these pieces of the workforce. Now, fortunately, thanks to the organization of African Americans themselves, eventually the parties both started bidding for the black vote by promising to expand Social Security to include African Americans. But the first impulse really from the Southern senators who dominated the Democratic Party in the 1930s was to exclude that. And that is, we could give you lots more examples, but that set a kind of pattern, a kind of context for most social welfare policy debates. Southern Democrats, really right through the 1960s, very reluctant unless the policies like welfare passed through state governments. Then, of course, they could exert their own racial controls. But it's not all a bleak story. There is another side to this story, and that is the very progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and some Republicans, Northern Republicans, also very progressive on race, even more so than anybody else in the country in the 50s and early 60s. And they saw a huge opening when Medicare passed. So as Medicare was being implemented, the implementer said, you may not have a segregated hospital if you're going to get Medicare funds. So to be certified to receive Medicare funds, you had to desegregate. And we went from a country that had many, if not most hospitals segregated, to a country where almost no hospitals, even in the South. In 1966, at the height of the Civil Rights Revolution, even in the South, there were no more than 30 segregated hospitals out of over 5,000 hospitals in the United States at the time. And those 30 were tiny little rural hospitals that held the line for a little while. So in this case, healthcare was the sort of great battering ram against segregation, and of course desegregated the hospitals. Now, this long history of social welfare policies being wrapped up in race on the one hand, and social welfare policies being progressive on the other hand, comes to a terrific head, comes to an explosive point under Barack Obama. After all, the first African-American president who makes his signature issue healthcare. And again, his staff members told us, you wouldn't believe how racial things kind of crept in to the healthcare debate. They wasn't shouted from the rooftops, but the mix of animosity towards immigrants and racial prejudice kept coming in. His staff were shocked at the sorts of things people would say, and they told us they told us again and again that that it was something that the administration just had to deal with. And Obama himself, of course, was always very cool about all this. No drama, Obama, and he always calmed his staff down. After all, he knew what it was like to be an African American man rising through American society. But there's one very telling quip from him. He goes out to Montana to do a couple of sessions on the Affordable Care Act, and then to go fly fishing with his family. It's a vacation trip. And as he comes out of the session on the Affordable Care Act, he comes not face to face because they're kept at a distance, but at people just screaming in anger at Obama and his socialism. And it was so shocking that his health aide, as he tells the story, turned to Obama as they got into the limousine to go fishing and said, "Are you okay?" And Obama mused, "I think they finally figured out that I'm black." And that's something that comes up in his autobiography several times. I think they finally figured out that I'm black. Most political scientists, most observers, and even Obama's staff and Obama himself understood that the healthcare debate got much more heated because it got entangled in this age-old American original sin. The original sin of race always been part of health and welfare politics and policies, but in this case really brought it to a fever pitch. Now, we always have since Harry Truman, we've always had huge, intense, crazy debates about healthcare, but this one went up a couple of notches higher because it got tied into fears about immigration. Remember Obama's great line of the 2004 Democratic Convention, "My father grew up in a tin room shack herding goats." And son of an African man, boy, that'll get the immigrant, the nativists really riled. And then, of course, he is half African himself, son of an African man. So that created a particular intensity that we saw come to the rise, not just in the Tea Party, not just in the grassroots, but among much muttering. Never out loud, but much muttering that the staff heard, even among some, not all, but some Congress people. And again, like Medicare, the triumph of the ACA is partially the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. That triumph is really a triumph, I think, of America overcoming a lot of anti-Black and anti-immigrant hostility. And when the chips are down, really passing a limited, a not, perfect healthcare plan, but nevertheless going ahead and passing a plan, which to us is a real testimony. And you can be for it or against it, but the fact that the United States overcame all this racial animosity, whatever side of the debate you're on, is a real testimony to the stick-to-itness, at least of the Democrats and of some Republicans who at least thought about embracing the plan, even though at the end they were frightened away, particularly by Mitch McConnell, who threatened to primary anybody who did. But nevertheless, boy, you never have to look far to see race in American politics, but in Obamacare, it was right there on the surface. And remember, just one last story, it kept coming up in all kinds of surprising ways. So at one point, the advisors to Obama said, "Okay, we're really losing this debate. You have to go out there and do a press conference on healthcare." And so he goes out, the Tea Party is screaming, everybody is, the policy seems to be going downhill and heading for defeat. A lot of moderates in Congress are saying, "Look, this has got everybody in our face. Let's just cut bait. Let's just do something for kids. Let's do something more modest. Let's go do something else." And Obama says, "No, we're going to stick with healthcare." And so he does a and the press conference, he really blows it. Oh, he's so worried about negotiating with the Republicans that he becomes Professor Obama. And even to us health wonks, it is really boring. I mean, he goes into he goes in deep into the weeds on healthcare, explaining the cost curve and all kinds of technical details. And then the very last question, someone from the Chicago Sun-Times says Skip Gates, the African-American professor at Harvard, colleague of David's, was arrested in his house last week. Would you comment on that? And all of a sudden, Obama, who has been Mr. Boring Professor, kind of lights up. And he starts with a joke. He says, well, I know what this is like. If I were breaking into my house, he goes, oh, well, my house is the White House. Of course, I'd be shot by the Secret Service. But, and then, so everybody's laughing and it's lots of fun. And he goes, let's face it. The police knew Skip Gates was in his own house, but they arrested him anyway. That was stupid. Oh, that big, fat, stupid descended on the debate. That's all the headlines said. No one could figure out what he was talking about with the cost curve and all that technical stuff. But stupid police, that they got. And the Fox News people were like, he hates white people. We've always known he hates white people. Now he admits it. The white cop is stupid. And, oh boy, he spends so much time trying to put out the fires from that big fat stupid. You may recall that he and Joe Biden and the cop and Skip Gates, by the way, eventually became friends with the cop. They sort of got along, but all too late to help Obama. The four of them sat there and had an awkward beer summit at the Garden to show there were no hard feelings in the Rose Garden. Now, of course, no longer. Trump has paved it over, but they sat there and had beer on the lawn and chatted amiably. But once again, one word, the cops were stupid, to arrest someone in their own house, just got the whole racial thing inflamed. And what is not said so often is that many Black Americans got pissed off at Obama too. They said, why don't you tell it like it is? We all know what this is like. You know what this is like. When was the last time a white professor was arrested in his own house? This is an opportunity to push back. And Obama, no. He was going to apologize for that stupid, backtrack for that stupid, try to keep everything cool. And thanks to his sheer political brilliance, they do pass the ACA in the end. But boy, race made it hard.
Absolutely. And I think that's one thing that I really got from your book is just this monumental effort that it took to pass the Affordable Care Act and all of the headwinds that the administration and the president were facing in accomplishing this. We have the racial element, we have the societal element, and then also because healthcare is an industry and it's tied to other industries. Of course, there are interest groups involved. And I think you did an excellent job of demonstrating how interest groups thwarted healthcare legislation time and again prior to the passage of the Affordable Care Act. Would you mind sharing what some of the key objections were to reform efforts put forward by presidents prior to President Obama?
Well, I think there were many, and some of them were made up. And some of them, the objections, reflected ideological objections, but were changed into specific arguments about facts. So one of the objections is always that somehow government will get between doctors and patients. That was the original American Medical Association accusation against the Truman Plan, and it remained part of every effort, no matter how much the proponents, Obama and others, said, no, that's not our intent, that won't happen. It ultimately forced Obama to say something that ended up biting him back, which was that this plan, if you don't like this plan, you don't have to change your insurer, and you can keep your doctor, you can keep your insurer. He was unable to do that ultimately for reasons that his staff did not anticipate, but that's one of the issues. Another issue has been pharmaceutical companies' fear of price controls. And one of the things they negotiated out of the Affordable Care Act in the deal making before the passage was that the Affordable Care Act would not be used to set prices for drugs through the Medicare program. They also negotiated with hospitals to make sure that hospitals would not face Medicare-style payment, and that, in fact, they would be able, in effect, to have a bonanza, the same way, by the way, that they benefited from DRGs when they were initially put in place. So they would get more business, and it would be privately insured, and private insurers pay better than Medicare. And there wouldn't ultimately be a public option, which is something that got dropped during the negotiations. So there was economic and ideological opposition to expanding coverage. Sometimes the ideological opposition took the form of economic arguments. Rahm Emanuel was critical to deciding on how to neutralize the industries that defeated the Clinton plan, especially the insurance industry. And as the book discusses, the sausage making was not pretty. The progressive left objected to it. It might have undermined support, except where did the progressives have to go? If they didn't like this version of coverage, what was the version of coverage that was going to be passed without these kinds of negotiated settlements with the major opposition? So it was actually, from a process perspective, from a presidential leadership perspective, a courageous and necessary thing to do in order to accomplish this unprecedented change in American healthcare.
DRGs, just a way of setting prices, hospital payments. Some of the presidential people may not know that. But notice what happened, that the Obama strategy was, I'm not going to fight the interest groups. I'm going to buy them off. And as David just said, oh boy, progressives didn't like that very much once it came out. But for a while, all the interest groups said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So many of them came to negotiate. And those that didn't, like the the health insurance industry, they were frozen for a while because they were debating whether to negotiate, whether to cut a deal. And by the time they decided, no, let's just bomb this thing, it was pretty much too late. So it was not only clever because some people made deals, like the pharmaceutical industry. Again, progressives hated it, but it got the job done. And then those who didn't make deals didn't start bombing the thing, didn't start bombing the plan until after it was well along the road. The going back to the 90s, the Clinton plan was taking missiles and drone attacks, to make a contemporary metaphor, even before the plan was written. So Obama froze the people who didn't make deals and made deals with the rest. So that really neutralized the interest groups.
But even the insurance industry knew that this plan was to expand private insurance, and they could do the math. They also knew that the way the market was going, insurance was becoming less and less affordable. More and more small employers were dropping insurance because they couldn't afford it. Their market was shrinking, and they needed the federal government to guarantee that this trend toward uninsurance would be turned around, because the future of their industry was not very promising without it.
And even though they didn't support the plan in 2009 and 10 when it was being passed, when the Republicans and under Trump tried to repeal and replace, who was one of the interest groups that opposed it? Why, the insurance industry, for reasons David just explained. They were right out there saying, don't repeal this thing. It'll be a mess without the ACA. So they went from opponents to strong defenders for just that reason.
Which may explain why they are under such relentless attack by the current administration. So this was a typically Republican constituency, private insurance, big industry, and I would wager that the leaders of most insurance companies trend right in their politics, but now they are the villain for the Trump administration because they have a vested interest in maintaining the Obamacare status quo.
And they make a dandy enemy. There's one more thing to say about interest groups, and that is, this is kind of not uniquely American, but boy, it's a very American thing that if you went to France, for example, it would be illegal. It would just be flat out illegal for a pharmaceutical firm to try to influence a member of the General Assembly. And the reason interest groups are so effective in the United States is because the congressional process, the policymaking process, is so fragmented, so difficult. If you're in a parliamentary system like, say, England or Germany, when you win an election, you've got the votes by definition. You've got a majority, and they are they have promised to pass certain things, and they will pass certain things. In the United States, you can win an election, but who's chairing the Senate Finance Committee? Who's chairing the House Ways and Means Committee? Where can they? And there's so many places to block that gives interest groups extraordinary possibilities. There's lots and lots of back alleys in which to mug any reform. Whether the reform is coming from the left or the right, the American system is designed in a good 18th century fashion to slow things down. So that makes the interest groups particularly powerful. And I don't care what your plan is and whether you're liberal or conservative, you're bringing something to Congress, you have to figure out how to deal with the interest groups, as David was just describing in the original answer to your question. So it's the American thing.
Not to mention the money and the cost of elections at every level and the importance of the well-to-do segments of society in influencing those elections.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that speaks to talking about healthcare in this context, but then also in so many contexts. And like you said, Jim, this system was designed for exactly this. It was designed to slow things down because we didn't want to go too fast. And in the 21st century, we have issues that need quicker responses. That's not the way our system is set up. And so it does become about trying to navigate that. And as was done with the ACA, trying to figure out how to get the best thing that you can forward so that at least you've got that change, you've got that in place, and then you can build from that. But if you don't have somebody if you don't have a team that can help to push that forward, if you don't align these interests, it's not going to happen. And then you're just left with the problem and it's just getting worse.
Yes.
Yes. One of the reasons why healthcare is now the presidential issue that it has become, and why it will continue to be that. And by the way, it's not just in the United States, it's throughout the Western world, is because healthcare is the dominant industry in the United States right now.
Number one.
It's a $5 trillion economy. If you took our healthcare economy and floated it out into the North Sea and made it a separate country, it would have the fourth or fifth largest GDP in the world. Anything that big that employs probably 15% of Americans is going to stay on the president's agenda for the foreseeable future. That wasn't always true, but it is now a kind of economic necessity.
Yeah. Yes, when David says it's a $5 trillion economy, the entire economy is only 27 trillion. So this is the biggest slice. And what's so interesting about healthcare is that it always eats a little bit more. The rising healthcare costs aren't just rising like all costs are rising. Every few years it takes an extra percentage of all spending in the United States. David and I can remember, not to date ourselves, when it was 6-7% of the whole economy, 5% of the economy. And people began to say, well, if we don't do something, someday healthcare will be 10% of the economy. And people used to shake their heads and say, no, that would be a disaster. But now here it is approaching 20%. And we will all celebrate when it finally hits that 20% and moves on to 21%. Because, hey, it's on its way to a bigger and bigger chunk of the American dollar. So, yeah, as David says, it's you can't duck this issue anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's so fascinating how, even though we're in the post ACA world and the debate is different, but knowing that this is an issue that we do need to address, we need to figure out, how do we approach this new reality? And in your book, you have another new reality that we're facing, which has historical implications, but within recent memory, in the last few years, we have faced this personally. And so turning to the other subject of your work, the other primary subject of your work, one of the key takeaways for me was just how challenging it can be to determine the proper response to biodefense threats. And in contrast to the global threat that COVID-19 posed, there's the example that you put forth of the 1976 swine flu scare, where the potential threat didn't ultimately play out, but there was a massive response from the American government. And so I was wondering, can you talk to us more about how presidential administrations have handled biodefense threats in the past? And what are the key lessons learned that need to be incorporated into future responses?
Well, I'll jump on this.
Yeah.
So we went about writing this book before the pandemic. When we began proposing it, and actually our first proposals to publishers did not talk about the pandemic because it hadn't started yet. And we quickly had to add it to the agenda of our investigation. And that meant we had to learn an awful lot about pandemics, which was not a planned task. And I came away partly because I trained at the Kennedy School, where the national security issue is front and center, coming to see pandemics as a national security problem. When you think about the 1.3 million Americans who have died in all our wars since the revolution, and compare that to the 1.2 million who died in 4 years of COVID, that number gives you a sense of the extent to which this pandemics and pathogens threaten our security in lives, potential lives lost. But also, we've had nothing since the Civil War that has had the kind of internal economic effects, the effects on education, the effects on equality and distribution of income that this event has had. It has changed our culture, it's changed our education, it's changed our politics, it's changed how we work remotely so much more than we used to. It is truly a blow to the body politic of the first order, and yet we have virtually no standing preventive or preparedness infrastructure to deal with it. There are a lot of reasons for that, but a lot of them are cultural. That for example, the intelligence community, which was very slow to understand the importance of COVID, doesn't view healthcare as its issue. We also have tended just not to want to prepare, not to allocate funds in preparation for something that even now is clearly a reality, but there's something about healthcare that turns people, especially conservatives, away from wanting to deal with it with the same kind of intensity and preparedness that they're quite willing to put forward just to make sure that Iran doesn't have missiles that might someday reach the United States 10, 15, 20 years from now. So there is much, much more we could do. Part of what we absolutely need to do is not to leave the WHO and not to destroy the USAID and not to reduce staffing of our State Department personnel in foreign embassies, because those are our early warning, our NORAD for biological threats to the American homeland. Boots on the ground in faraway places that can quickly gather intelligence about newly emerging pathogens in China or Ecuador or South Africa or wherever they may show up. Those are critical to early warning and to preparation. We need a White House infrastructure as part of the National Security Council, a biohazard or biosecurity directorate, which, by the way, Trump disbanded early on in his administration. So the White House needs to be better prepared internally, and we need to stop the incredible attack we've launched on the CDC, reducing its capacity to monitor infections around the world. And that is sort of the other critical part of our early warning system. We need a better platform for developing vaccines, and we need to be investing heavily in new vaccine development that is quickly responsive. Our flu vaccine enterprise is slow. We have to start producing flu vaccines months before we know what the latest variant of the flu is. We were just damn lucky that mRNA proved so effective in developing vaccines against COVID. It was an incredibly good fortune. Millions more Americans would have died from COVID if we hadn't had that good fortune. So we need a comprehensive review of what happened during COVID. There were mistakes made. We should make sure we don't repeat them. We need to invest in it. It's not happening. Pandemic has become a 4-letter word, especially on the right. There's deep skepticism about whether, in fact, there was anything called COVID. And so there's a huge cultural and political task to be undertaken by a president. Only a president can do this, to bring us back together and prepare for future pandemics.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, that was one of the reasons when we were setting up this interview that I really wanted to have both of you on was to speak to the history that we've lived, to know and acknowledge that this happened and it's important for us to study. As somebody who loves history and embraces history, it's about trying to build from our history, both our successes and our shortcomings. And one of the things that I was really fascinated in your book, you described the public health system in the US as, quote, a 19th century contraption with little capacity to monitor the population. And that, I think, gets to kind of the heart of the issue that you were talking about, David. It's something that we're glad we have it in place, but we realize its progress has been hindered. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about how this compares to other systems internationally.
Yeah. This is partially a federalism story. Public health systems are local. States are constantly under budget pressure, and so they cut local public health systems. And then states don't respond to the federal government because public health is local. And so what we have is a system designed in the late 19th century. Uh, American medicine was a mess in the late 19th century, and the progressive reformers of that era built up these public health systems. They were models of efficiency in 1900, but they're now getting to be way out of date. And because of all those kinds of cuts, these are often organizations that are still using fax machines and pencil and paper rather than computer. They just don't have the funds. So when California, a really quite progressive state, wants to monitor what's happening on the local level, the locals often say, we don't know. And then when the federal government asks California, what are your numbers? California says, well, we don't really know. We've got incomplete data. And the comparison internationally, Jerry, is fascinating. Really brought home in this case when Debbie Birx came from South Africa, where she was helping to fight infectious diseases, to coordinate the White House response to COVID. And she said to the CDC, well, give me your data. And they gave her some data. And she said, no, I need the basic raw data. She said, this is all, they said, this is all we have. She said, for heaven's sakes, South African countries have better data than you do. And they say, well, we are not allowed to compel states to report, and states are not don't have the capacity to compel local agencies to report. So, incredibly enough, the United States was flying with data that was less effective. Never mind, Switzerland or Germany, than the nations in Southern Africa. As Birx herself told us, their reporting systems weren't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but there were light years ahead of what the United States was doing because it's a 19th century contraption. It just hasn't been redesigned. And you can be sure that in today's heated environment, with budget cuts still on the table and tax cuts pushing budget cuts, that many states continue to cut their public health budgets and continue to undermine public health authorities. 29 states, after the COVID experience, actually reduced their local public health authorities. Those were largely, but not exclusively, red states. So what we have, following directly on what David just told you about the need for a national response, reaching out globally and including and reaching into the White House and the kinds of briefings the president gets every day. We also need monitors and sensors for what's going on in terms of disease and pandemics in the United States, But those neurons, those information neurons just don't exist now. We've allowed them to atrophy, and we continue to allow them to atrophy. I can make you a list of 50 sexy things a governor can do, but building up public health agencies usually is not one of them. But boy, we will pay the price. We paid the price, and we will pay the price again until we begin to develop a 20th century, much less 21st century infrastructure of public health.
The irony is that with the federal government in florid denial that we need to do pandemic planning, the states are likely to be the place where whatever happens in this area will go forward, primarily blue states.
And we know some states, very advanced, got the message, got the memo, primarily blue states. In Massachusetts, there's going to be very elaborate systems. In other states, not so much. So, and on the federal level, if you're a federal official looking at the data coming in, you'll get some data from some states that will take this seriously. You could, anybody who pays attention to politics can wheel those states right off, and other states terribly resistant. So we'll have a pretty foggy view. But even the blue states are only now thinking, oh, we really were caught unprepared this last time. We'd better build this out. And it's hard because there's lots of things they need to do, particularly as the federal government backpedals from all kinds of responsibilities.
During the pandemic, we were relying on Israel and Great Britain for a lot of real-time information on the effectiveness of vaccinations because they had comprehensive databases that they could mine to look for real-world data on vaccine effectiveness. We did not have that capacity. So actually, about a year ago, an effort was made to give the CDC the authority to require the reporting of data on infectious diseases from the states. It was defeated in the U.S. Congress. We are in a state of denial bordering on amnesia concerning the COVID experience and what can be learned from it. And it's quite astonishing and perplexing to watch us do this as a country, to national security so self-consciously because of a political and psychological blind spot.
There's just give you a conclusion. There is a philosophic difference, partially between Democrats and Republicans, that all societies are a collection of individuals and communities. And Democrats tend to think in communal terms, and these are essential communal issues. And Republicans tend to think in individualistic terms. And this public health is not something that is amenable to just individuals, like eat spinach and everything will be fine. No, it doesn't work that way. Layer on top of that the idea that the physicians around Trump publicly disagreed with him. Boy, that is not something that the current president takes lightly. When he said things like, let's get sunlight or bleach under someone's skin, Fauci was out there saying, no, don't do that. Not a good idea. And so again and again, they corrected him. They contradicted him. They didn't roll their eyes, but practically. And Trump has never forgiven them. And Trump world has really become anti-expert in a way that really is a terrible challenge. It's just a problem for the United States to be dismantling its scientific establishment. And it came directly out of the tensions and the debates during the COVID experience, this war on science. It's not that there hadn't been an anti-intellectual, anti-expert, anti-vaccine sentiment. It goes back all the way to the Washington administration, of course. It ebbs and swells. Your history buffs will remember Richard Hofstadter's The Anti-Intellectual Tradition in American Life. That has been something, as Hofstadter described in the 50s, that comes and goes. But that got turbocharged during the COVID experience as Trump and Trump world and Trump's followers thought these scientists, they're just so full of themselves. They trot onto television and contradict the president when he is just grasping to find something that will solve this pandemic. And worse, Trump himself, we haven't talked about this, but he achieved something magnificent with his vaccine development. And frankly, it took a Trumpian way to do it to get that vaccine. He just was a bull in a china shop. Anybody gets in your way, knock them down. I'll find $20 billion. Never mind. Here it is. So he was very effective in a typical Trumpian way to get this vaccine. And then he goes before his people at a rally shortly after losing the election and brags on the vaccine, and his own people boo. And he gets the message. Bragging about vaccines is not what my people want. And so he races to get ahead of his own constituency. And when he comes back a second time, not only is he pissed off at Birx and Fauci and all the scientists who contradicted him last time, who wouldn't praise him to the skies, but furthermore, he knows that the anti-vax movement has merged with his movement. And so the anti-science wave is born. And David and I try to explain in this book the terrible cost that is going to do. I mean, science up until 2020 was the pride of the nation. We have won more Nobel Prizes in science since 2000 than the entire rest of the world put together. And now this fury coming out of the populists, out of the right populists, driving Trump forward, is creating a terrible dilemma for the United States that will echo for a long time to come. And that is really going to be a test. Democrat or Republican presidencies in the future will have to find a way to get science, to get medicine, to get healthcare to get coverage out of this partisan divide and make it once again something where we debate policies, but don't throw science itself, public health itself, into the maw of our
There's
culture.
a glimmer of hope in that the Congress recently rejected Trump cuts in the NIH budget and actually increased the budget. So there remains bipartisan support for the NIH in the House and Senate. And I think that there is a line which the current administration and even Trump is backing off on this, that RFK Jr. has sort of passed a line that he cannot sustain in terms of support in the Congress, and with the American public. So I don't think that we're going to do away with vaccination entirely in the United States. There's a correction going on right now. I wouldn't be surprised if there were some changes in leadership in the healthcare space in this administration running up to the midterms. But there's no question that we are unilaterally disarming against future pandemic.
David's note of optimism really fits American history, that these populist, angry, anti-expert, anti-science movements tend to crest and then recede. And there are some, we could make a pessimistic case too, I'm sure, but as David just said, there are some hopeful signs that it has peaked and is beginning to recede, really before reality. And we'll see as vaccine resistance creates terrible problems for the vaccine resistors. Reality, as every generation, political or not, discovers, reality eventually comes back to bite you.
Jim and David, I thank you so much for your work on this and in highlighting this, being able to put it in the historical context, and then also helping us to understand the history that we've witnessed, the history in the making, helping us to see what the path forward may look like, and that we've had debates before, we've had things that we've had to overcome in the past, and it can look bleak. It can look challenging. It can look almost impossible. And we've seen in the past that we can overcome these challenges. It's just trying to find what we need to do and the impetus, the strength, the fortitude to move forward.
And the leadership.
And the leadership is so key.
Well put, Jerry. We couldn't have put it better ourselves.
Right.
Well, and there's so much more in your book that we didn't get a chance to talk about. So, for our listeners, I highly encourage you pick up this book, Whiplash: From the Battle for Obamacare to the War on Science. Jim and David, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your insight, and congratulations on the publication of this book.
Thank you. Nice to
Thanks,
see you, Jerry.
It was really fun to do your podcast.
So glad to
We'll
have
be
you
back
here.
with our next book, we hope, in the not too distant future. But I've just sprung this on David, so.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. Sounds like y'all may need to have a call after this.
I've stuck my wife.
Thanks again, Jerry. This was really
Bye,
fun.
Jerry.
Thank you both so much. Thanks so much again to David Blumenthal and Jim Marone for their time and for the insight they provided in our conversation. I highly recommend you pick up a copy of their book, Whiplash: From the Battle for Obamacare to the War on Science, as they go into further detail than we had time to discuss in this episode. I'll have a link on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There you can also find past episodes of the podcast, links to more about all the American presidents, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help support the Presidency's podcast. Thanks so much to our patrons, whose financial support ensures that I have the equipment and resources needed to keep this good work going. As a token of my appreciation, all patrons get access to an ad-free feed for the podcast, which includes some special patron-exclusive episodes. I just finished up a series on the Postmasters General prior to that office becoming a cabinet-level post. And next up, I'm going to share some outtakes from the Calhoun episode. If you'd like to become a patron of the Presidency's podcast, just go to patreon.com/presidencies and sign up. If you're not able to commit to a monthly donation, there are other ways you can support the podcast. I have a research wish list available at tinyurl.com/presidenciespodcast with books identified that will help to prepare for upcoming episodes. You can also leave a rating and review at Apple Podcast, Spotify, Podchaser, or anywhere else with that capability. I cannot thank all of you who have fulfilled book requests as well as shared with folks why they too should be listening to the Presidency's podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also reach out on social media if you don't follow me there already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Last but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
It's tax season, and at LifeLock, we know you're tired of numbers. But here's a big one you need to hear. Billions. That's the amount of money in refunds the IRS has flagged for possible identity fraud. Now here's another big number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, we'll fix it guaranteed. One last big number. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast for the threats you can't control. Terms apply.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Burn the Boats from Evergreen Podcasts. I interview political leaders and influencers, folks like award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien and conservative columnist Bill Kristol, about the choices they confront when failure is not an option. I won't agree with everyone I talk to, but I respect anyone who believes in something enough to risk everything for it. Because history belongs to those willing to burn the boats. Episodes are out every other week wherever you get your podcasts.